Alverstoke Antiviral considers the origin of great is thy faithfulness. We catch up with Steph and we re-chew self-righteousness. You're watching Alverstoke Antiviral. Well, now it's time for the Sunday re-chew. Welcome everyone as we re-chew a talk that we heard on Sunday at church. And Colin's going to find me some questions because I was the one doing the talk.
That's right, yes. So you looked at blame, and we looked at the parable of the persistent widow, as it's sometimes called, and also the story of the two guys who went into the temple to pray. Now, on that subject of blame, how much of an issue do you think that is in life for us on a daily basis?
Oh, I think it's massive. It's like every time when we get annoyed or aggravated, I find, or something doesn't go quite right, and we start, getting frustrated with people, or we start holding on to things, or we start, churning stuff over. It's always about blame, isn't it? It's always a sense of injustice, or a sense of wounded pride, perhaps, or a sense of, I think it explains so much behaviour humanly.
Okay.
Certainly,
How much do you think that widow blamed the judge, or?
How much do you think the widow blamed the judge? Oh, well, I imagine she blamed him quite a lot because she kept on going to him and saying, "Come on, give me justice." So, she was probably wanting justice. He was probably part of the problem, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I think. Well, she blames her adversary, or there's some injustice going on because she asks for justice against him. Otherwise, she wouldn't be doing it, would she? And she wouldn't be against the judge. So I think there's definitely a sense in which she is aggrieved about something. Yeah.
Okay. And that desire for justice, which she obviously had very strongly. It was quite personal, presumably, from what we read in the text. But how does a desire for justice affect us from day to day? Because she doesn't drop it, does she? She persists. She keeps on asking for it to be resolved. And I wonder where we see that sort of, what stirs up that sort of sense in us today, that sense of, this needs to be resolved, this is not right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How does it affect us from day to day?
Well, I think you see it very clearly cut in cases when people have been, are victims, or families of victims of crime and things like that, and they have long-standing battles for justice. You see it in workplace issues where people have grievances and they want to take those up and they want justice. You see it in all sorts of ways. I think, thinking more broadly, I think as Christians, if we believe the world is God's world and that the world is not as it should be because of sin, I think we should feel it every day. Because, we see a world in rebellion against the God who loves it and who made it. And we should feel aggrieved about that. We should care that people sin against God. We should care that people reject Jesus. I'm not saying get furiously angry with your non-Christian friends, but, if we care about God, we should care. It should affect us. That we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where God is rejected. And therefore, and his people are rejected. We should care that Christians suffer and are treated badly and persecuted in many places. And I think we should be crying out to God for an end to that ultimately when he comes and his kingdom comes. And I think perhaps we get too comfortable in the world, don't we? And we sort of sit back and think, oh, it's all fine, and we forget that to be Christian, to follow Jesus, to follow someone who is going to be king of a kingdom which is not of this world. It is to come. And when it comes, it's going to be brilliant. And I think if we have more of a sense of that, then that might make a bit more sense of the persistent widow, perhaps.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting that of the two guys in the temple, one has no sense of anything wrong with himself, and the other one has a deep sense that the wrong is just all about himself. He doesn't really seem to notice the tax collector, but the tax collector notices the no, the Pharisee, but the Pharisee notices the tax collector. Yeah, I just find that really interesting that he accepts responsibility for what he's done, and he comes before God, a bit like in a similar way to the way the woman's coming to the judge. He comes to God asking for mercy and for kindness, not justice. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Pharisee has to look around. He has to look around because the reality is he is a sinner. We see his pride, we see his egotism, we see his self-righteousness and his vanity in his prayer. I thank you, Lord, that I am not like other men. He is a sinner. In fact, both men are sinners. The question is, how do they deal with their guilt? And it's the easiest thing in the world when you're guilty and you're under fire and you're a fault is being pointed out, for you to find someone else to blame. Oh, look, what about that person? What about that person? I mean, that's how I react when I've done something wrong, and I start thinking, well, yeah, but I never did that, though, did I? I'm not as bad as this person. Or oh, remember, that person had a part to play as well in whatever misdemeanor has occurred. And you naturally try and cope with it by looking down on others and trying to play comparison games. And that's the essence of self-righteousness. It is to compare yourself to others, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to cope with your guilt by not going to God and saying, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, but you're trying to deal with it by making it out to be not as bad, and so you're looking down on others. I think that's what's going on. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Those are the things I was thinking of asking. Yeah, that was it.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for those questions. Right. Well, now it is time for our interview. And now it is time for our book of the week. And we're going to look at a very short book this week, a short book between two giants, between Jeremiah and Ezekiel in the Old Testament. There is a little book of 5 chapters, which is easily overlooked, but it's actually, we miss it at our peril. And that is the book of Lamentations. What is Lamentations? Well, to put it in really simple terms, I'd say Lamentations is a book about pain. It's a book about pain. We've seen the poetry of love in the Old Testament with Song of Songs. We've seen the poetry of praise with some of the Psalms and the Hallelujahs. But Lamentations is another point, a bit like other Psalms and a bit like Job, where we have the poetry of pain. And we look at the sound of a soul in anguish. I was going to say that Lamentations is a bit like a really sad song, but I changed my mind about that. I don't think that's nearly strong enough. Lamentations is much more severe. This is not some sort of wistful piano ballad with Adele, being a bit sad. This is much, I think it's much more like the sound of a human wailing. If you've ever been sitting on public transport and there's a child next to you and who has a problem and they are letting rip and filling the air with the sound of their discontent and their inconsolable, uncontrollable unhappiness, that wailing sound, that is the sort of distress that the book of Lamentations brings us. It's the sound of pain in words. And to understand why it's here, it's not just here to show us that the Bible is real about issues of pain. It's also here to show us something about this particular sort of pain that certain people experienced in the Old Testament story, and what that experience can teach us and show us, because that specific experience that it's talking about is the exile, the judgment of God expressed against Jerusalem in the exile. And we've talked a lot about the exile, haven't we? We've seen it in the history books. The history books describe it and narrate it from a historical standpoint. The prophets prophesy about it. They say it's coming. They warn against it. We've seen that with Isaiah and Jeremiah, talking about the Babylonian takeover that is going to come in 587 BC, around then. Jeremiah is even there on the ground while it happens. And Lamentations gives you an inside angle on that experience. A bit like sections of Jeremiah, we get an inside angle about someone who's on the ground during the exile while the city is being uprooted and living in the aftermath of that. And so that's why some people think Jeremiah might be the writer of Lamentations, because he does personalize his emotions sometimes and talk about how awful the experience is of God's judgment. But that's what Lamentations is. It's 5 chapters in the shoes of someone going through the judgment of God in the exile in the Old Testament. And there are things we can learn from it about the judgment of God, and about that expression of the judgment of God which we can learn from as well, not least how we can find hope of avoiding the judgment of God. So I've got a few points to share in a nice slideshow, which I'm going to pull up in a second. There we go. And when I pull this up, you'll see the first point is simply that the judgment of God is comprehensively awful. Judgment of God comprehensively awful. So there's Lamentations. There's a ruined city, a bit like Jerusalem. And the point is the judgment of God is comprehensively awful. And I use that word comprehensive because I mean it's totally from A to Z. And I say it's from A to Z because Lamentations very literally takes us from A to Z, because the form of the text is in 5 chapters, 5 poems, one making up each chapter. And most of them, chapters 1 to 4, are A to Zs. So line 1 starts with an A, and then verse 2 starts with a B equivalent, and it goes through the Hebrew alphabet. And you can see this in your Bible. You should have a little footnote at the start of Lamentations 1 to 4 saying something like, this chapter is an acrostic poem, the verses of which begin with successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's trying to direct you to something in the text that you can't see in an English translation unless they try and translate it. So the first word of each line is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But that's what we're doing. We're looking at alphabetic poems, mostly. They are A to Zs. And chapter 1 has 22 verses for the 22 letters of the alphabet. Chapter 2 has the same number. Chapter 4 has 22 verses. Chapter 5 has 22 verses, although chapter 5 doesn't have an A to Z for reasons we might come back to. And bang in the middle is the longest chapter, chapter 3, which is like the others. It is alphabetic, but it's triple alphabetic. So all the others have 22 verses. The middle chapter has 66 verses. And instead of a verse beginning with A verse beginning with B, it has A, 3 verses starting with A, then B, C, 3 verses starting with B, and so on. And C, D. So it's an intensified triple alphabetic pattern, really. And that chapter is longer, and that's also the chapter where we find the hope in the middle, where it's most intense and the emphasis lands. And what do we make of this alphabetic device? Because it does come up elsewhere in the Bible. We see it in the Psalms. We see it in Proverbs as well, occasionally, near the end. And what's it here for? Why do this? I think it is possible to overread the alphabetic structure, possibly. But I do think we can say some things. I think the alphabetic form is to give us a sense of totality, a sense of comprehensiveness, because we go from A to Z. We cover the whole alphabet. When Jesus in the New Testament in Revelation says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, using the Greek letters there, what's he saying? He's saying he's the beginning and the end and everything in the middle. He's making a point about totality. It's the span that is total. And I think that's what's going on here. The sufferer is trying to express the totality of the judgment experience he's going through. And also that judgment is a totalizing experience. It's not a bit part experience. It's a comprehensive experience. It's wholly immersive. It's not just a bit of an intrusion, partly disrupting his life, which is carrying on. No, it's overwhelming. It's holistic. It's hitting him in every department and every letter of the alphabet. So I think that's what's going on there. It's a comprehensive judgment. And I think the alphabetic structure points towards the comprehensive nature of it. Some people point out that there's a bit of a strange tension between the fact that he's talking about the sack of a city, which is a chaotic experience, isn't it? But he's doing it in a very orderly, structured way. And is he trying to process his feelings through structure and bring order to the chaos? Maybe hard to say, but we can say, I think, that it's a point about it being total and comprehensive. And the point is, the judgment of God is comprehensively, from A to Z, awful, awful. And let's just have a little taste of the text. So, Colin, perhaps you could read this as it comes up. This is Lamentations 1. Could you read that for us?
Yep. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her, and they have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labour, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations, and she finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress.
Thanks. And one of the great tools for reading the Bible when we look at poetry is to ask a simple question. How is this supposed to make me feel? What feelings and emotions is this touching on? And perhaps you can sense that the feelings and the emotions of this passage are despairing and horrified. How deserted lies the city. How like a widow is she. Notice the dramatic role reversal there. She was the queen among the provinces. Now she's become a slave. It's expressing the awfulness and the sadness of the situation and the weeping. And there are many aspects of the awfulness of God's judgment that are brought out in the text of Lamentations. We've seen some of them before, actually. So you see the loneliness in verse 2. Can you see that? Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. We saw that on Sunday with isolation, didn't we? How part of God's judgment is loneliness and isolation, like Jesus on the cross. And we see an aspect of that here, that Jerusalem is deserted of allies and is being, elsewhere we see her being mocked by surrounding nations. And there's no rest, there's no resting place. And she's being pursued. It's very sad and it's comprehensively awful. And why do we need to know this? Well, we need to know this. Hopefully we're not in a city under siege, or the city that's been sacked today in the West. But we need to learn from this expression of God's judgment, because it shows us something about what God's judgment ultimately in the future will be like. And it will be awful, and it will be total. You know, being God's enemy is not fun, and hell is not fun. That's what temptation tries to convince us of, that sin leads to happiness, that we can get away with everything and there are no consequences, and rejecting God is a happy path. It's the path of freedom and liberation and joy. The reality is it's awful. It's awful. I'm reminded a bit of that moment in Luke 15 in the parable of the lost son, where the son runs away and he's farming with the pigs, and he's starving and he's tempted to eat the pig food. And he comes to his senses and thinks, what am I doing? This is miserable. This is awful, being an enemy of God. And I think a similar point is meant to cross our minds reading this, that it's awful going up against God and suffering his judgment. It's comprehensively awful. And we should be so thankful if he has spared us from that, as he does through Jesus. So that's point one. Next point, the judgment of God is God's action. It's God's action, and we see this in the text of Lamentations, especially in chapter 2. So if I sent you a homework assignment to write down all the things in Lamentations 2 that God does, I think you would be staggered. I think you really would be staggered, because we like to think, well, God is love, therefore he doesn't judge. And if he does judge, well, you know, he does it impersonally or indirect, in a detached, passive sort of way. No, Lamentations 2, God covers with a cloud. He hurls down, he snatches up, he tears down, he cuts off, he withdraws his hand, he burns, he strings his bow, he slays, he pours out his wrath. He's like an enemy. He swallows up, he multiplies mourning, he lays waste, he destroys, he spurns, he rejects, he abandons, he breaks, he gives over, he overthrows, he slaughters. Even as I read that, I'm a little taken aback by how active God is in this judgment and how like an enemy he is. That's how he's described. He's treating Jerusalem as his enemy in a very active way, and the sufferer is in no two minds. This disaster he's going through is not because God is weak and other nations have overpowered him and God hasn't been strong enough to get his way. No, this has happened because God has decided to judge his people because they have broken his covenant. Lamentations 3 says, "Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both calamities and good things come?" And the answer is yes, this is from God, this judgment. Personal and active. Now, not all cases of suffering are direct judgments on specific sins, so we need to be a bit careful about reading things into sufferings we go through. But in this case, in the Old Testament, we have God's word that this is what's going on. And why do we get this? Why in the Old Testament do we see God save a people, bring them to the promised land, and then treat them as an enemy? Well, it's because they've broken his law. And because through this microcosm, as God deals with one people in time and space in the Old Testament, so we learn what he is like. And through the story of Israel, we are seeing in a smaller case an expression of how he will one day treat the world, how he will judge the world if the world remains his enemies. So we have to see here, God is very active in his judgment. You don't want him as your enemy. Hebrews 10 says it's a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Because the judgment of God is God's action. And it's because he is good, precisely, that this has to happen. Because he cares about sin. He's not apathetic to human evil. It's the goodness of God that made him create the world. That same goodness is the goodness which drives him against sin and means he must judge sin. And it's his very faithfulness and commitment to good that makes him an enemy of this city. There's a point in chapter 2, amid all God's other terrifying actions, where it says this: he, God, has fulfilled his word, which he decreed long ago. And that sounds like a happy verse, doesn't it? Oh, God fulfilled his word, which he decreed long ago. God keeps his promises. He's faithful. We'd expect that in a salvation context. But the point is, it's the faithful character of God, which means that the judgment happens as well, because it means he's faithful to his promise. He's faithful to his promise to judge. So what we have here is a faithful, good God being active in judgment. And what we're seeing here is that the journey of the Bible is not a journey from nasty Old Testament God to nice New Testament God. No. God is both loving and just in the Old Testament. And Carson says both of those are escalated and elevated. One doesn't win against the other. Both are elevated in the New Testament. It's one consistent God because of his character that this is happening. But here's the good news in Lamentations. There is hope in the judgment, especially in chapter 3, in the middle of the pain, in the middle of the book, there's a real moment of hope. But what do you think the hope is grounded in? What do you think the hope is grounded in? It's not grounded in the idea that God has lost control. It's not grounded in the idea that God is going to change and become nice. No, it's actually grounded in the steadfast character of God. The same character that has brought the judgment, the same God is the God who is the way out of this. And we see this in Lamentations 3. So this is Lamentations 3. I'll read the first column. Colin, maybe you can read the second column.
Yep.
This I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth.
Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men.
And just look at what that passage, set in a lament about the judgment and suffering going on around, says about God. Look at all the stuff about his character. 22, steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. Great is his faithfulness, verse 23. That's where that hymn comes from. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is good, verse 25, to those who wait from him. This talk of in 31 of the Lord not casting off forever. And he has compassion, and he has steadfast love, and he does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men. And that's very literal, verse 33. NIV says, does not afflict willingly the children of men, although that's slightly less tight, isn't it? Because it raises the question of, well, if he's not doing it willingly, why is he doing it? But here's the point. He does will to judge. We've seen that. He's very willing and active in terms of how he judges. But the point is, he does not afflict from his heart. He does not enjoy judgment. It might be a good thing. It might be a necessary thing that evil is punished. But he does not afflict from his heart. He takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He's not vindictive and bloodthirsty. And it's this steadfast mercy of God, even in the midst of judgment, that this sufferer is looking to find hope. It's not, God has failed, let's hope he changes and becomes nice. No, it's that God is steadfast. The steadfast mercies of God are the only hope. The very faithfulness, great is your faithfulness, that brought about the judgment is the same faithfulness that becomes the lifeline. Because if God doesn't change, then his promises to bless that he's made since Abraham are going to hold firm. And if we've seen that he keeps his word in judgment, well, then we can see he will keep his word in salvation as well. So the hope of Lamentations is not great is our faithfulness. Let's pull up our socks and be nicer to God. No, it's great is his faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness. It's about banking on his steadfast mercies to deliver from judgment. And the sufferer is left there sitting in silence, waiting for God, recognizing it's good to wait for God to act to save. And the glorious good news of a certain major Christian festival, which is coming soon, but I'm not going to name because it's too early in my view, is that actually God's faithfulness has been shown to be reliable. God's steadfast mercies have given us the greatest gift of all in sending his son, Jesus Christ. Because the salvation that the sufferer is waiting for in Lamentations, as he sits there amid the city, is a suffering that has come in Jesus Christ. And the wonder of the gospel is that Jesus has suffered the Lamentations experience. He has gone through the exile. He has been judged under the judgment of God and had the wrath of God poured out on him on the cross, so that we wouldn't have to, and so that when we trust him, we can have the hope of a future as God's friends, just as if we'd never sinned. So the sufferings in Lamentations, they're quite Good Friday-ish, because they are a taste of the sufferings that Jesus goes through as he suffers the judgment of God. And the sufferings we are delivered from. Even the image of the cup that Jesus uses about, take this cup from me, the cup of God's judgment. We see that in Old Testament texts. We see it here in Lamentations. But that Jerusalem is drinking a cup, and the cup is going to be passed to the nations. So Lamentations, the steadfast mercies of God are the only hope. It is about pain. It is about the pain of the exile. It's about a pain that's comprehensively awful. It's about a pain that's God's action. But in that pain, it says the steadfast mercies of God are the only hope. It's God's character. And isn't that the gospel? Isn't that the gospel? That God saves us from judgment when we rely on his character and his mercy to save us from Jesus. Not great is our faithfulness, but great is his faithfulness. And so the application is put your trust in his faithfulness, in the steadfast mercies of God, and sing great is thy faithfulness as much as is humanly possible. And that's the homework assignment this week. Sing great is your faithfulness in whatever way you can manage. So Colin, questions, Lamentations?
Yeah, just one question really. We're not as far as we know, experiencing God's judgment in the way that Jeremiah and the people did then. So how do you think this might help people like us to deal with things when they don't go as we'd wish, or when they're painful or difficult?
Yeah, well, I think although we can rush into over comparing ourselves and thinking, oh, I'm going through the exact same experience, and reading the anger of God into our own suffering sometimes when that isn't warranted, particularly if we trust in Jesus, because there's no condemnation if we trust in Jesus. At the same time, I think the thing that comforts the sufferer is that in his sufferings then is the same thing that comforts us in our sufferings. It is the character of God. It is the faithfulness of God, and the fact that we can put our trust in him and wait for his mercy to bring about a full restoration, and to end suffering for his people, because that's ultimately what the gospel will achieve. It's forgiveness of sins and the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. And so we've experienced the forgiveness of sins now, but obviously we're still in a fallen world, and we're still suffering probably. And so I think we are still clinging to the mercy of God. And I think that's the thing. That's why great is our faithfulness. As a Christian hymn is mostly about God's preservation. The hymn is written about, how you've provided all these blessings to me, and summer and winter and springtime and harvests and all that, and also pardon from sin and a peace that endures, and your presence. And it's that same steadfast God who the sufferer could turn to, even in his situation of judgment, which is much worse than a Christian suffering who is not under the wrath of God, obviously. Even in that situation, then we can trust in God as well, and we can turn to him, and we can rely on his faithfulness. So I think it's the same medicine, just applied into different types of suffering. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. That is Lamentations. Go and sing Great is Thy Faithfulness, if you can get away with it. And until next time, stay close to Jesus and wash your hands. Well, I'm joined now here by Steph. Steph, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Steph, how have you been keeping in lockdown, in the new lockdown and all that stuff?
Okay, so I'm really, really busy with Harriet. Harriet really is my need to go out and need to be out in the world, really. Taking her to school, and I do meet with people every day because of the school run. But actually, it's really fine. It's fine as long as you've got your mask on. They'll let you in the school grounds.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah. I walked past the school run today, actually. I went for a walk in the park early, and there were, quite a lot of people there. And I thought, oh, yeah, it's obviously, part of the daily routine that's carrying on, which is, it's nice to have some normality, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm thankful that the schools are open at the moment, but whether that'll change, I don't know. But if it does, it won't be a surprise, to be honest.
Right. So, while we've been in lockdown, what have been some of the blessings and the challenges of that for you?
Okay, so the real blessings that I want to share, I'll do the blessings first, because challenges are something else, but the blessings really, I really feel like I know God better, and that the Bible has been an absolute complete, we call it a tool, but it's so much more than a tool, because whenever you go to it, and whenever I've been going to it more and more, I have so much peace from it. It's an incredible book, and every time we're taught something, we learn something again and again and again, and I've never really realised that before, but because I've been quiet and always remember that we still know that he's God, or that I am God, as it says, it makes a huge difference. So that's a massive blessing to me. I've made some new friends at school, so some of the mums that I see daily, Harriet's got a little set of friends now, so most nights after school they go and play in the park. So I often find myself sitting on a bench with two other mums really quite close. Like, I know we're not supposed to do that, but we're outside and I don't directly face them anyway. But that's been really encouraging, that I've made, normal friends, and they accept me because I'm a believer. and they're fine with that. So that's really, really something, I think. And having so much support from Harry at school. Head teacher is always approachable, is always positive, and he encourages me because every week he puts out biblical scriptures with the newsletter. And it really is something when you read the first bit of the newsletter is always about the Bible. It's Bible scripture, so at the moment it's Matthew. And he's changed his logo at school, and it's basically says faith, fun and friendship as we learn, love and fly. And I just really like it. But it's a Church of England school, and they really focus on God. And Harriet, so much so, as a blessing that this is praying. And this morning I caught her saying the Lord's Prayer. So I was delighted by that.
Oh, great.
So that's a massive blessing, because if nothing else, in this dark world, she's seen the light at school. And that to me is a real encouragement when I'm a believer myself. And I hope one day she grows up to be a believer. Yeah, I think that's... Oh, and also my family have been incredible. So since me and Martin separated, they've been really supportive, like more than ever. So they've been down here 3 times in lockdown, and they've been able to come because their area was the same as ours. And I really thank God for that, because they're 4.5 hours away. So it's 200 miles away, and yet they've been down in the car. And that's a real thanks to God that I've had them, and they ring me every day. So they're being massively supportive too. And they're always asking about church, even though they don't believe themselves. So that I really like that. It always gives me that warm feeling that they know that God's in my life. So it's cool. So that's the blessings really. What did you say about the
challenges? Anything like that?
Challenges. I think health-wise, just anxiety. But then I've got a lot to do. I'm in control of an awful lot of things now. The most easiest thing, which I thank the Lord for, was finances. The straightforward change from an income to go on to short-term, I hope, benefits. And I say hope because I really want to get back out working as well as juggling Harriet. But God knows when that's going to be. At the moment, I'm just taking it a little bit easy because it's quite a lot to comprehend in my mind as to what is going on, really, with what I'm going through. But what was I going to say? Yes, that's quite a challenge, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's quite hard.
Yeah.
But no, it is a challenge, but then I realise that my strength comes from God, but I also realise it's more of a challenge when I don't rely on Him. So why don't I? Steph, what do you do that for? Kind of thing. So that's one thing. And then challenges of noisy neighbours. They are so noisy upstairs. They're like elephants, and if we're not asleep by 9, 2 of us, which we are generally, that's it, we're awake till the early hours because they bang and bang and bang upstairs. I don't know what they're doing up there, but still, I just kind of get used to that. And being used to being on my own with Harriet and being completely in control of everything. That's all. But God knows that situation, and I keep trusting Him.
Steph's neighbours, if you're watching this, please buy some slippers. That could be helpful. Well, I mean, I suppose you've already answered this, but I was going to ask about encouragements, and you've mentioned a few. And something I like to ask is, what's God done for you this week? It sounds like there's lots to be thankful of, even though
it's tough. It is tough. I reached out and spoke to a dear sister and dear brother in our church. I don't think I mentioned who they are, but they really encouraged me. They set up a Zoom meeting. They do an awful lot for the church, and nothing's ever too much trouble for them. And they just really helped me, and have been so kind about things. So much so that hopefully Harriet will have some new little play friends, and that she'll grow up with them and learn from them. But last week I reached out to them because I felt the Lord was kind of giving me a bit of a nudge, and it was so right that I did, and I'm really glad that I made that time with them. That's really encouraged me. And this verse has been with me all week, because of them, and because of the love that they show and the knowledge in their faith. And that is, your word is a lamp for my feet and a light on my path. And that has really helped me in the last week.
Oh, that's terrific. Praise the Lord. And in terms of praying for you, I mean, you've mentioned a lot of things that people can pray for. I suppose you mentioned anxiety and general life stress and stuff like that.
Yeah. Basically, all I want from God, well, for me, is to keep trusting and to help me feel strong when I feel really, really like I'm in a difficult situation, and to seek Him first before trying to do it myself.
Yeah, it's a funny prayer, isn't it? Because it's a prayer that for help, to rely on His help. So it's, in some ways, it's a prayer for us to do nothing, isn't it? But us to remember that, you know, things are ultimately in God's hands. But we do forget that, don't we? Yeah.
And then there's just one song that always comes to mind that I've been thinking about, and I actually listened to it this morning, and it's Because He Lives, I Can Face Tomorrow. Because if He wasn't here, I wouldn't be the person I am. So it goes right back to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, where it states that we're made in His image, and if we trust Him, He's right there.
Oh, great! I'm glad you're getting fabulous music as well.
Music's great. It's a very big help, and I'm thankful for your musical talents and our musical gang at church too, which we miss, because, you know, we all miss it, don't we? But we know that one day we'll be back together.
Yeah, it's going to be good to sing.
Yeah,
when the time comes. Yeah,
indeed.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steph, for sharing that with us, and good to see you.
See you.